everyone. I want to begin by thanking the staff of the Columbia Museum of Art for making this possible, particularly the director, Della Watkins, Catherine Walworth, and Jackie Adams and Kaylee Vaughn, but also the staff that simply made the presentation of this painting possible. At my institution, this painting took a village, and it very much did here too, I suspect. So it's wonderful to have it here and to have the chance to talk with you about it this evening. And also, I hope you enjoy it over the next few months. Let's adjust this a bit. How's that? Can everyone in the back hear me? No. Okay. This project took place at the intersection of art conservation, science, and art history, and it is a project that could be described from a number of different perspectives. It required the collaboration of conservators, scientists, artists, archivists, and art historians. No painting this large can be cared for or really even moved, for that matter, without the assistance of many people. Preparators, woodworkers, metalsmiths, registrars, craters, and photographers, just to name a few. This project was truly a group effort, as I said before. Mural came to the Getty in 2012 as part of one of our conservation partnerships. These are collaborations that happen between the J. Paul Getty Museum, my institution, and institutions all over the country and the world. And it brings paintings and colleagues to the Getty and really enriches our experience as well as sort of professional exchange. So this is Mural, and Mural is the largest painting by Pollock, and you all had the privilege to actually see it tonight, so the images I show you on the screen, unfortunately, will not quite measure up. The painting was commissioned by Peggy Guggenheim in 1943, and it was really Pollock's first big break. It came with a year's contract and the promise of a show at her gallery, Art of this Century. It also marked a breakthrough moment for Pollock as his work teetered on the edge between the still somewhat figurative works that reveal the influence of his teacher, Thomas Hart Benton. And here, I show you Going West of 1934 and 1935 from the Smithsonian American Art Museum. So at this moment, he's about to have a massive breakthrough. And this painting is also from 1943, and its composition with pouring from the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden. And then ultimately, he achieves the 1947-1950 period, and this is Lavender Mist from that classic period, which is at the National Gallery of Art. When the painting was commissioned, Marcel Duchamp actually advised Peggy Guggenheim to have Pollock paint the painting on canvas rather than on the wall of her entry hall in her apartment building in New York City. And that was a really wise choice. At the time, Peggy was renting the apartment building, and Duchamp wisely suspected that at some point she might leave, which in fact she did after the war was over. So this is actually an elevation of the townhouse, and you can see Peggy's apartment on the fourth floor, and Kenneth McPherson, her friend, lived above. And this is a layout of the entry hall, and I think it's particularly important to note that the space that you would have had to see the painting was really only about 13.5 feet. That was as far as you would be able to get away from the painting. And also it's interesting to think about the lighting in the space. So there was just that one window that you see in the lower right corner. And that window actually would have really been the only source of light. Peggy had installed electric lights. However, whenever they were turned on, it blew the circuits for the entire building, which frustrated Kenneth McPherson. So consequently, they were not turned on very often. This will also give you a sense of what the space was like and how compressed it actually was. And that's important to think about because your experience of the painting would have been all-encompassing. And at a certain point in time, which you'll hear about in a moment, that sense of the painting was lost. So in 1948, Guggenheim did, in fact, leave, and she was returning to Europe after the war and promised the painting to the University of Iowa. There was some miscommunication in the transfer, but ultimately the painting came to Iowa in 1951. The painting came to the Getty at the request of the University of Iowa Art Museum in 2012 in order to undergo treatment and study. Of particular concern was the fact that the painting had a notable sag at the center. It had also been varnished, and that's important. It was a step that Pollock had never taken. The painting was unvarnished until it was varnished in 1973 as part of a conservation treatment. This painting has also, as Catherine mentioned, been the subject of a number of myths. So most notably, the idea that it was painted in one frantic burst of creativity over basically a 24-hour period, New Year's Eve between 1943 and 1944. That's not true. There are also other changing ideas about when it was painted, that it was painted in the summer, painted in the fall in time for a party. And again, that is partially true. So it was painted in the summer of 1943, and we now know that from archival information from the Museum of Modern Art and from the Pollock papers. Also, the idea that it was cut in order to fit into that vestibule space, that when Pollock had arrived, that it hadn't fit in the space, and Marcel Duchamp came to the rescue with a solution, and the solution was to cut the painting. So when I first learned about Mural as an undergraduate art history major, I learned that tale, and in fact, it's not true. And colleagues, that is actually not work that was done at the Getty. A number of colleagues had looked at the painting, in particular in connection with the 1998 retrospective, and been able to establish that, in fact, it wasn't ever cut down. It has 4 intact tacking margins. So that idea is also not true. But this is really the tale of the material life of a painting, how it has changed over time, how the changes have affected the way the viewer experiences the painting, and ultimately the effort to bring it back to something closer to what the artist intended. So this is Pollock Studio, and again, the idea of space and experience of the painting becomes really crucial. When Catherine was speaking about the painting, she talked about the fact that it really was very much defined by Pollock's own physical stature and the very physical experience of painting it. He actually took out a wall in the apartment in order to fit the canvas. And the earliest mention we have of Mural is actually on a postcard he writes to Lee Krasner in mid-July of 1943. However, it's in a letter to his brother, Charles Pollock, written on July 29th, that we really get the details about the commission. He writes, "I have a year's contract and a large painting to do for Peggy Guggenheim's house. 8'11" by 19'9", with no strings as to what or how I paint it. I'm going to paint it in oil on canvas. They're giving me a show November 16th, and I want to have the painting finished for the show. I've had to tear out the partition between the front and middle room to get the damn thing up. I have it stretched now. It looks pretty big, but exciting as all hell." So here is Pollock standing before the bare canvas, which for anyone who's painted is a very intimidating place to stand. So we know that Peggy Guggenheim ordered the canvas, and actually during the war years it would have been a pretty extraordinary purchase. It is a solid piece of exquisite Belgian linen canvas prepared by a company in Belgium that is still making the very same canvas today, and that's a company called Claessens. And I would like to, it's not clear who paid for the stretcher and whether Pollock may very possibly have built it himself. I would like you to ask you to note that the painting is clearly propped up on either end, and it appears to be sagging slightly in the middle. So you can see the red marks both behind Pollock and in front of him, and then how it's touching the floor in the middle part. And that's important because one can easily see how applying paint to a canvas so positioned might actually lock that sag into place in a quite permanent way. And over the course of the project, we began to realize actually that mural sag was present right from the start. So these are some of those images also taken in the studio, and these are in the Archives of American Art in Washington. And they are early mid-process paintings. And again, you get a sense of exactly how tight the space was, since the photographer required 3 shots to cover the whole painting. So another note that gives us a sense of the timing that things happened and the fact that it definitely did happen over the summer. Jackson Pollock writing to his brother Frank in January of 1944 saying, "I painted quite a large painting for Miss Guggenheim's house during the summer, 8 by 20 feet. It was grand fun." This image of Pollock and Peggy before the painting is really wonderful to see, and it's particularly interesting because the molding at the top and bottom for a long time had been mistaken as a frame, and that comes into the conversation later. But actually, through research done by an art historian named Angelica Rudenstein, we now know a great deal about the townhouse and the fact that that molding actually extended throughout the entire house. And it's interesting to think about what this moment meant for Pollock. So he actually, as part of an application for a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1947, he wrote, "I intend to paint large movable pictures which will function between the easel and the mural. I have set a precedent in this genre in a large painting for Miss Peggy Guggenheim, which was installed in her house and was later shown in the large-scale painting show at the Museum of Modern Art." And it's interesting to realize at this point in time, this is probably about 1947, as the painting is moving from Guggenheim's vestibule, from her townhouse, to the Museum of Modern Art. They actually take the time to photograph it. This is at Vogue Studios, which was a professional photography studio. And it's really interesting to realize that at this point, Pollock hadn't yet signed the painting. And it's also interesting to look because, again, it's long been assumed, this is a well-known photograph, that that's a frame. But in fact, if you look a little closer, for anyone who's painted or ever bought a Frederick Stretcher at Blick Art, there's actually a miter in the corner. So he's using the stretcher bars from the painting to actually delineate the space. And that's interesting as well, particularly for a painting that has such crucial use of space and energy and where the edges are essential. So here you see Mural at Moma in the large-scale modern paintings exhibition. And that ran from April 15th to June 1st, 1947. And this is the first time that a signature appears in an archival photograph on Mural. So it was hanging at the Museum of Modern Art, and Pollock decided that might be a very good time to sign it. So again, the framing question, and you see the frame on the picture in the forefront, in the foreground. However, there is a sort of exhibition frame that was chosen for a number of pictures, which you see here on Pollock as well as on the Leger in the background, and actually the Balthus in the far background. And this is actually a condition report from the 1947 exhibition. When paintings travel, it's very typical that they receive a very detailed description of exactly what the issues are from a condition standpoint. And barely 4 years after its creation, you can see that Mural already had myriad small scrapes, cracking, and flaking paint. One mark is noted as a possible nail scrape. Large paintings like Mural often lead very difficult lives. Because of their size and considerable weight, they are more susceptible to the forces of gravity than smaller paintings. They become splayed out at the corners or sag in the middle as gravity takes its toll. Large paintings are often rolled on long cardboard tubes to make transporting them easier. And actually in the Vogue Studio photograph, you can see that in the lower left corner. We think that's actually the tube that the painting was rolled on. And that's not an easy process, as one can imagine. And as Mural moved from Pollock Studio to Guggenheim's entrance hall, and from there to Vogue Studios, on to Moma, and then up to Yale, the painting was rolled and unrolled, stretched and unstretched at least 5 times, all before it ever arrived in Iowa. Thanks again to the intrepid research of art historian Angelica Rudenstein and the efforts of the Museum of Modern Art archivists, we now know for certain that Mural's sag dates to at least 1947, a mere 4 years after it was created. In a letter from Moma curator Margaret Miller to George Hamilton of Yale University Art Gallery, where the painting would be shown after Moma, Miller warns Hamilton that the canvas is warped in the center in such a way that it can never be stretched true again. And this was important knowledge going into this project. She goes on in the letter to discuss the framing solution Moma had used to conceal the sag, and essentially they built a frame that had a very large rabbet, so they were able to hide it. Unfortunately, they destroyed the frame and weren't able to send it to Iowa. So this is the painting at Iowa, and for a number of years it hung in the art studio. It also hung in the library at certain points in time, and one of the great pleasures of this project was to meet artists and University of Iowa alumni who really had such a connection to the painting because they had been one of these painters working beneath it. And can you imagine what it would have meant to be working beneath a painting by Jackson Pollock, who at that time, of course, wasn't as well known. Although, actually, at the time this photograph was taken, this would have been about 1951, or after 1951, and the Life magazine article that really called him America's greatest painter would have been out at that point. 20 years after the first Moma exhibition in 1967, Mural was on the move again, traveling from Iowa back to Moma for a retrospective of Pollock's work. This proved to be a crucial turning point in the material life of Mural. Moma conservator Gene Volkmer found the stretcher inadequate and observed that it had actually cracked in one place. And you can start counting now. Please take note, this is the first stretcher cracked by Mural. So you can see the sag quite clearly in this detail. And Volkmer also noted areas of cracking and lifting paint. She advised lining the painting. Mural would have its first major conservation intervention. So lining is a process that involves adhering a new secondary canvas to the back of the original canvas for added support. During the lining process, the original canvas is infused with adhesive, either directly or when the two canvases are adhered to one another. This can secure flaking paint by essentially re-adhering the paint to the original canvas from behind. At the time, lining was a standard and well-accepted treatment for the kinds of problems that Mural was exhibiting, although it is not necessarily the same approach that would be taken today. So the man hired to undertake this truly daunting task was Louis Pomerance. Pomerance was a well-respected colleague in the field. He is the person who established the conservation laboratory at the Art Institute of Chicago. By 1973, he was in private practice and was something of a wide-ranging hired gun in the Midwest, the perfect person to take on such a monumental treatment. So this is his 1972 condition report, and my favorite portion of it notes that the paint layer is not in a generally good state, not in a generally sound state. And these are a few images that just show the kinds of damages that he was looking at. So flaking and cracks, and also this is probably the nail scrape that is referred to very early on. And it's really interesting to think about how these small damages actually are a form of visual noise that really disrupt the movement of the brushstrokes. And movement in a painting like Mural, which is all about movement, is crucial. And so that was something that we spent a great deal of time thinking about once the painting arrived at the Getty as part of the conservation treatment. So in preparation for lining Mural, Pomerance prepared 50 pounds of a wax resin adhesive. And the formula he used is a little bit unusual. It was a moment in time when people were experimenting and trying to come up with a very particular tailored kind of solution. And we actually together as a team reworked the formula. And so we basically made it up ourselves in order to better understand the material that we would be working with. And those are the images you see across the bottom. Once the lining was completed, the next step would have been measuring and marking out what would become the new turnover edge, the point at which the canvas turns the corner of the stretcher and wraps around the edge of the stretcher. Here you see Mural on a working stretcher, so the edges are actually splayed out. And the painting was to be restretched on a rectangular stretcher, so essentially squaring it out. And they're actually using a chalk line, like a snap line that you would use in a construction site situation, for example, in order to mark where the edges would be. So, and here, Pomerance is recording the size of the painting after treatment. All of the tacking margins would have been on the edges when Pollock finished the painting, of course, and now some of them were on the face. And essentially, squared out, the painting came to about 8 3/8 inches at the right, and 19 feet 10 across at the top, 19 9 7/8 at the bottom, so it actually wasn't even a quite perfect squaring out. So this is Mural almost 40 years after the lining upon its arrival at the Getty in 2012, but still much as it had been left in 1973. You can see the exposed tacking margins marked in red here, and here is a detail of the tacking margin. And the drips that you see across the bottom actually are a wonderful indicator that the painting was painted on the wall. and upright, because if you looked at that earlier photograph, the painting was leaning against the wall. Paint would have pooled at the bottom and then dripped underneath, and that's what you're seeing here. So this tacking margin, this portion, was really never intended to be on the face of the painting, and because it is such a painting about edges and movement, it really became a part of the composition in a way it was never intended to be. So here's a look at the back of the 1973 stretcher as it appeared on arrival at the Getty in July of 2012. And it was a fairly consequential stretcher with a lot of aluminum support that had been added in the past. The aluminum that you see on the edges here on the corners is actually an easel that we developed in order to be able to move the painting around easily. The lining was really quite intact when it arrived at the Getty, and it had held up beautifully for 40 years. Oftentimes, linings over time do delaminate and begin to come away. This one was still doing its job. Pomerance got the big job done, and he did it very, very well. So during the 1973 treatment, the painting was also varnished with Solubar, a synthetic acrylic varnish. And varnish in general has a tendency to even out areas of matte and gloss, obscuring the variation of surface that Pollock had achieved, as well as the texture of the brushstrokes. The choice to varnish the painting was consistent with standard practice at that moment in time. The varnish was intended to protect the surface of the painting, but it was a choice that Pollock hadn't made. During the technical study of the painting undertaken by my colleagues, Alan Phoenix, Wendy Lindsay, and Tom Lerner of the Getty Conservation Institute, we learned a great deal about the paints that Pollock was using and the kinds of surface that he'd achieved. Due to the way that Pollock was adjusting the paint, he'd achieved a varied surface with wonderful gloss and matte effects. Much of that was lost after the varnishing, and more about the technical study in just a moment. It's also important, again, to note Pollock didn't varnish the painting originally. This image was taken in 2012 when the painting arrived at the Getty. It was taken in specular light, which essentially means that direct light was shown at the painting perpendicular to the canvas, and that was basically being used as a way to document the even glossy quality of the surface. And as you can see quite clearly, it really made it very difficult to take the whole painting in. And although this is extreme, that's a pretty consistent or pretty accurate description of what the experience of standing in front of the painting. You had to essentially dance around a bit in order to be able to really catch more than just a portion of the picture. And that's essentially what these gentlemen are doing. This is our museum director, Tim Potts, on the right. And why have I told you this tale of change? Because all of the movement, all of the damages and the interventions they necessitated have influenced how the painting has been seen for the past 40 years. The tacking margins on the face of the painting represented disruption to the edges of the painting as Pollock intended them, and the varnish really changed the surface and the viewer's experience of the painting. Over time, it is a varnish that, unlike a natural resin, which becomes sort of a golden glow that we're all familiar with, in the cases of a synthetic, they oftentimes become quite gray. Some of them sort of have glass transition temperatures just above room temperature, which means that they're constantly imbibing dust. So we were also looking at the painting through about 50 years of dust, 40 years of dust. So in short, the painting now looked very different than it did when it left Pollock's studio. And additionally, the 1973 stretcher really wasn't supporting the heavy double canvas as well as it might have. Mural had actually cracked yet another stretcher. Essentially, these were issues we faced when Mural arrived at the Getty in July of 2012. All projects of this sort begin with a great deal of looking. Conservators tend to be very conservative people. Examination and documentation of what we find is a very crucial part of our work, also simply to provide a record for the painting and for those who will care for the painting in the future. So as we come to understand a painting and begin to plan its treatment, we use microscopes and magnifying loupes and any number of other ways of looking at the painting. So this is a list of some of the techniques that we use, and essentially we do a lot of looking and thinking before we do anything else. And as I mentioned earlier, the technical study of the painting was ongoing throughout the two-year period. But we basically did a ton of photography in normal light, but then also a ton of photography through microscopes, and you see an example of that here. In the center is a portion of the X-ray, which is very valuable for understanding paint layering in some cases, and also the state of the painting. And you also see, starting at the top, that's normal light and infrared, which can also give you a sense about sequence, and then transmitted light, which can give you a sense of where the paint is thickest and thinnest, and then also at the very bottom, UV light, which can tell you where, in some cases, there have been damages or repairs, or sometimes can give you a really interesting indication of varnishes present, and sometimes even pigments present. So here are some of the questions we had hoped to answer during the technical study. What kind of canvas had Pollock used? What kinds of paint? What binders? What pigments? What was the process? How long did it take to paint the painting? What was the paint application like? Distinctive or unusual practices, were there any? And also deterioration. Were there any sort of what we call inherent vice issues, or painting pigments or paints that had deteriorated over time simply because of the materials from which they were made? And here are some of the techniques we used to answer those questions. And as I mentioned before, the technical study was carried out in collaboration with my colleagues at the Getty Conservation Institute. And what follows is really only a summary of their work. There's actually a document about this thick, which gives you all the details. So optical microscopy, SEM-EDS, which is a scanning microscope, electronic microscope, FTIR, which can tell you about the medium that was used, Raman, which can tell you both about pigments and medium, and a number of other things, and X-ray fluorescence, both spot size X-ray fluorescence, and then a new technique called macro X-ray fluorescence, which allows us to literally map the chemical elements on a painting and really learn a great deal about the pigments used. And finally, X-ray diffraction, and then GC mass spec, another technique that's used to identify media. So the canvas is a commercially prepared linen, as I mentioned before, likely from Claessens in Belgium. It's a 3/2 basket weave, and it has a double commercial priming, meaning it was supplied by Claessens, and it was lead white over zinc white. The unpainted tacking margins, just to clarify again, are present on all four sides. Again, the painting was never cut down. So how do you study such a massive painting? It's a huge undertaking. And essentially, we decided to choose a focus area that we felt was representative of the materials present on the painting. And that's what you see here. And then once you've chosen that area, it's maybe about this big. And once you've chosen that area, you focus in even more. And these are cross sections. So in order to make these, we take a very, very tiny sample from the painting. And I should clarify, all the techniques I discussed previously, the majority of them are non-destructive. A few of them require a very small sample. And when we do take a sample, it's smaller than the period on a page. And we are usually able to use several techniques on it, and that allows us to garner from a tiny bit a huge amount of information. And in particular, I would say that the second cross-section is the most interesting to us because it actually clearly makes it quite obvious that a lot of the work was done wet into wet. But then also on the left, that's very striated. So those layers were actually dry before the next layer was applied. So it let us see that while, yes, there was some bursts of creativity and there is a lot of wet into wet, which you can see with the naked eye on the painting, it also let us see that, in fact, areas of the painting had dried quite thoroughly, again on the right, and again between the yellow and the pink in the third cross-section. So areas of the painting had dried quite thoroughly before Pollock moved on. This couldn't have been painted overnight. So that sort of added a little scientific basis to demystifying that idea. This probably was the key to the whole project. This cross-section literally includes every pigment Pollock used on the painting. So all of the colors, we realized just the moment we looked at it under the microscope, how many of the pigments were present. And then as we sort of began to look at everything else, we realized that we kept coming back to this one and that they were all present. And so for all the artists in the audience, these are the particular pigments that Pollock used: bone black, titanium zinc white, viridian, cadmium red, alizarin crimson, cadmium lemon, cadmium yellow, phthalo green, viridian, cerulean, phthalo blue, cobalt blue, and umber. And there was one paint that was clearly different, and you can see it actually in this area here, and it is that very creamy white paint. And a cross-section of it, which you see here, showed some particularly interesting additions and made it clear that it was not like the other high-quality artist's oil paints that Pollock had used. It actually bears a strong resemblance to the kinds of additives and the kind of paint structure that you would see in a very cheap, economical house paint, probably water-based. And that was consistent with the fact that there were small areas of flaking and that they oftentimes, some of the worst flaking on the painting over time, it happened in these cream-colored areas because oil and water, as we all know, don't quite mix. And so a little bit of further study made us realize that, in fact, he was using casein. It probably was a house paint. If you had just ripped a wall out of your apartment, your rental apartment, you might have house paint on hand as well. And so essentially, we began calling it a retail trade paint, and yes, probably a cheap house paint, an economy interior water-based paint for walls. And we purchased this Firestone paint from the appropriate period off of eBay. It still sits on my desk. I can't quite part with it. And so we began to look more closely in order to understand what this casein was and why he was using it. And also, it's really crucial to understand that this pushed back the date for Pollock introducing other paints into his work by a good bit of time. And so what you see here is actually probably my favorite swirl of casein. And it's interesting because it's now a very translucent paint. At the time, in 1943, it would have been appealing to Pollock because it would have been white and covering and opaque and very quick drying. But it's actually, of course, as we talked about, not really compatible with oil paint. But it would have been very useful if you wanted to kind of edit. And as we began to look more carefully, we realized that is indeed what Pollock was doing. So 70 years later, what did that paint look like? It was increasingly transparent, and that was actually due to a chemical change in the paint. And there was a loss of brightness. It probably would have been very bright white originally. And it was very brittle, and we could see areas where it had flaked, contributing to that overall sense of sort of visual noise. And then also, there were simply adhesion issues, so that was contributing to the flaking as well. And thanks to a really extraordinarily exciting new technique called hyperspectral imaging. So conservators have often used different wavelengths of light to really learn a great deal about paintings. But in the past, infrared imaging had really been sort of confined to a narrow, to a range. And then also you had to kind of look at the whole range. Or maybe you could look at, use a bandpass filter and look at a section of it. But with hyperspectral imaging, you can actually take images of the painting and then basically dial in for certain reflectances, certain wavelengths. And that let us literally map the casein across the canvas. And we were able to sort of better understand the ways in which Pollock was using this paint. So we also used that technique to be able to look at the umber underlayers. So many of you may have sort of caught a glimpse of figures who would have marched back towards the elevator. And that's what you see here. And that really ties this in with Benton and with Benton's ideas about, this is Pollock's teacher, about basically having these umber forms and then wrapping the forms of the painting around it. So in summary, there would have been a varied palette of high-quality artist oil paints, different modes of application, but then this very idiosyncratic use of cheap water-based paint. And also we came away with the impression that essentially there had been 3 phases of painting: a vigorous initial flurry, a prolonged deliberate solidification phase, and a final retouching editing phase, with much of it executed in casein. And truthfully, other than the casein, there was very little paint-specific deterioration. So the conservation treatment we undertook was very much dictated by Mural's early history and the choices made during the 1973 treatment. And like all conservation treatments, the artist's intent really guided our work. What did Pollock intend? What did he want us to see? How did he want his painting presented? And all of these are tricky questions. We hope to remove the varnish and recover something closer to the surface that Pollock had intended. We hope to improve the structural integrity of the painting because we suspected it might travel. And in the process, consider how the aesthetic issue of the tacking margins might be addressed. Once we'd examined and documented the painting and the technical study was well underway, we moved forward with the cleaning. The first step was a surface cleaning intended to remove accumulated surface grime from the varnish, and we used an aqueous solution rolled across the surface with hand-wound cotton swabs. There were a great deal of cotton swabs. Here you see Lauren Bradley, who was the assistant conservator on the project, removing the surface grime. The next step was removing the varnish, and we knew from early testing that the varnish could be removed with several different solvents or solvent mixtures. That was actually a great relief because Solubar is something of a thug varnish in that there are proprietary versions of it in batches which actually cannot be removed over time and become increasingly difficult. So we were actually quite relieved that it was safe to clean the painting. And again, we used hand-wound cotton swabs gently rolled across the surface. And in the lower right is Johanna Ellerstorfer, who was our graduate intern at the time and who also worked on the project. Here you see a detail of the painting taken in specular light before and during cleaning. And I've left the clean line here at the bottom, in the bottom image, so that you can get a sense of the change. The removal of the varnish revealed a varied surface with areas of matte and glossy paint. The varnish was quite thick, and removing it restored the subtle texture of the paint surface. The white areas of unpainted ground near the top began to throw light in a little differently as the texture of the canvas was freed from this rather thick varnish. And I think when you think about cleaning an old master painting, we often talk about the restoration of a sense of space because a unified coating really compresses space on a figurative painting. And I think for my colleagues and I, it was particularly fascinating to realize the extent that was true on an abstract painting as well. And as we removed the varnish, it became much more possible to sort of literally enter the painting. The space in the painting opened up. And this is the painting after cleaning, and really go downstairs. The sense of space in the painting really did become much less compressed. And because the glare of the varnish was gone, one could take in the whole painting at one time from one spot without having to move around to avoid the glare. The cleaning was relatively straightforward. The structural issues were a bit more complex. When conservators have a large or difficult problem, we often turn to our colleagues and rely on collective expertise when considering how to approach our work. Thanks to the Mellon Foundation, we were able to bring together a number of colleagues to consider these issues. Those who'd worked on Jackson Pollock, those who were experienced with large paintings or massive wax linings, and those who knew the history of the painting or were engaged with problems of interpretation. And this was essentially the chance to have everyone in the room who we would have called. So that was a great privilege. And essentially, there were two options. The first option was to place the painting on a rectangular stretcher to make the decision that Pomerance had made, and it would have maintained the edges as they were after the 1973 treatment. The visible portions of the tacking margin would have remained on the face of the painting. The second option was to place the painting on a shape stretcher, which would allow us to return the edges to something approximating what they originally were, without tacking margins on the face of the painting. Shape stretchers are an accepted and not uncommon solution for the distortions often seen in large paintings. The eye expects to see a rectangle and thus overlooks minor distortion of that rectangle. However, this was a more extreme distortion, and we were not entirely certain that a shape stretcher would be successful in fooling the eye for the crucial moment that would allow a viewer to see the painting first and perhaps notice the distortion second. Like Margaret Miller in 1947 and Marie Pomerance in 1973, we also briefly considered the option of framing out the slivers of the tacking margin. But as I've mentioned before, the styles of frames that are generally used for Pollock's would have made that impractical. It's more typical to use a strip frame for Pollock's. Also, aside from the Moma exhibition frame and Pollock's attempt to sort of delineate the edges with the stretcher, Mural had never really had a frame. It had had that molding at the top and bottom when installed in Guggenheim's townhouse, but never a proper frame. It was a mural, after all. In order to evaluate the effect of a shaped canvas, what the effect of a shaped canvas might be, the Department of Imaging Services at the Getty undertook their own monumental project. They printed a full-sized image of the painting so that we could do a mock-up, and that's what you see here. Jean Carricker, our framer, mounted it on foam core of the appropriate thickness so that it would throw shadows in the same way as the real painting. And this is in our design studio with gallery lighting up above. And it is, once we'd seen the mock-up, we kind of knew, ideally, we wanted the painting on a shaped stretcher, a stretcher that returned the painting to its historical edges. However, it is one thing to shape a paper version of the painting, and a very different thing to adjust the shape of a 70-year-old painting with 2 canvases and 50 pounds of lining adhesive. Considering these issues had been one of the topics of discussion during the experts' meetings. We were not entirely certain that the painting would go along with the plan. The process of answering that question involved a lot of small tests and very careful progression toward action. In order to adjust the turnover edges, we began by making a mylar tracing of the turnover edge, basically documenting all of the evidence we had of the old turnover edge. And the mylar tracing was then transferred to a mylar pattern, and that pattern later became a wooden pattern for the new stretcher. We then flipped over the painting, removed the old stretcher, and transferred the new old turnover edge onto the back of the lining canvas using a pouncing tool to gently mark the wax, and that's what you see happening here. Separating the tacking edge of the painting from the tacking edge of the lining was a necessary step in adjusting the edges. On the right, you see us adjusting the edges with the wooden stretcher pattern in place. And it is always a good idea to double check your work, and that's what you see us doing here. Next, we turn to the problem of building the shape stretcher. These are the gentlemen who took on that monumental task, Tony Moreno and Lauren Vincent of the J. Paul Getty Museum's preparations department. Here, they're milling Alaskan cedar that we used for a new stretcher. And if anyone's ever seen Alaskan cedar all milled down, it's an extraordinary wood, almost knot-free and goes on for miles. And apparently it's rather like getting to work with butter. Working on a new stretcher also helped us to consider the installation myth further, specifically how the stretcher might possibly have been cut down during the 1943 installation. And this line of tack holes, which you can still see downstairs on the painting, had been noted by colleagues in the previous examinations and put forth as a possible explanation. Perhaps the stretcher had been cut down and the extra canvas was folded around the stretcher, not cut. There might be a kernel of truth, in other words, at the center of the installation myth. But how easy would it have been to cut down a stretcher on the fly in a tight space? And again, this is the Pollock Studio's image you saw earlier. And as you remember, the framing elements here are not a frame. They're actually peripheral stretcher bars. And cutting of the stretcher of the center joints would be one option, but probably the more efficient choice would be to cut a new miter at the corner here and here, which wouldn't have been particularly difficult undertaking, even on site, on the fly, using simple tools. This was a moment in time when people really had extraordinary hand skills. And this was likely the more practical option, especially if the painting had already been stretched when you realized that, oh no, it doesn't fit. So back to the new stretcher, which we hope will never need to be cut down and will never crack. This is a scene of a test fit where we're basically ensuring that it fits. And what you see, the aluminum portion, is actually a face-mounted panel that sits behind, just behind the canvas, not quite touching it, but just behind. And that essentially supports it during transit and also protects it from any sort of impact. And here we are restretching the painting using push pins before later going back and tacking it with copper-coated steel tacks. And those were isolated with small pieces of mylar. The final step of the treatment was in-painting, and that's the touching out of small old losses, which you see us doing here. And it was at this point that we had a lot of conversation about how far to go, how many of the small losses to retouch. And we decided to really focus on those that interrupted brushstrokes and ensuring the continuity of Pollock's original brushstrokes. And we used stable reversible paints designed for conservation, and we also in-painted the edges on the losses on the edges as well, since those were something that had occurred later as a result of all the stretching and unstretching. On the face, again, we retouched small losses that interrupted the flow of brushstrokes or other compositional elements. And this is Mural with its new stretcher and its old varnish on the wall in the galleries at the Getty. And I really wish I had an image of it on the wall here because it just looks extraordinary. However, the best after treatment image, it really is downstairs. Much of the work that we do in conservation involves undoing the well-intentioned work of those who have come before us. Louis Pomerance's 1973 treatment was something that had achieved its goals, and it had been very successful in stabilizing the painting. We were able to work with it rather than undoing it or reversing it, which was a great pleasure. Once a painting, or really any work of art, leaves an artist's studio, it becomes subject to countless small and large changes, intentional and unintentional, which profoundly influence our experience of that work of art. As viewers, an understanding of the ways in which a work of art is changed can profoundly inform our understanding of it. Removing the 1973 varnish restored the subtle play of gloss and matte across the surface. Placing the painting on a shaped stretcher restored a certain energy to the painting and reestablished the visual boundaries of the painting. The technical study gave us a better understanding of how Pollock was working and the materials he was using, and let us understand how much earlier he began experimenting with paints, even before his well-known experiments that came later. Mural is now much closer to how it looked when Pollock first painted it. Thank you all for your attention this evening.